Last night, just before 7:30 p.m., there was a 6.0 magnitude quake off the coast of Oregon. Um, it seems that it happened in a relatively active area. Can you tell me about the area where this quake occurred?
Yes, it occurred quite a long way offshore, about 180 miles offshore Southern Oregon there, on the what's called the Blanco Fracture Zone. That's a fault zone that's entirely offshore and in the ocean. So it's different from our Cascadia Subduction Zone, fortunately. Pretty big earthquake, magnitude 6, but that's actually not uncommon out there.
A lot of questions people in the Pacific Northwest have, especially after what we saw with the Japan major earthquake and even the major earthquake we had in Russia. Why was there not a tsunami for this type of quake last night?
Yeah, the couple of reasons. I mean, one is just that at magnitude 6, that's pretty small for a tsunami. Remember, the magnitude scale grows, logarithmically, so it's a lot smaller than a 7, 8, or 9. But also, it's the kind of earthquake that the motion is all side by side in the seafloor instead of up and down, and so that generally tends to move less water because it's just the side by side motion of the Earth's crust. So both of those are factors why there really was no tsunami risk, and in fact, no tsunami from this one.
We heard lots of reports from USGS and you guys up there at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network about people on the coast feeling the earthquake. You said it's several hundred miles offshore. How were they able to feel the earthquake that far away?
Yeah, at magnitude 6, that's still a pretty substantial earthquake, and just as on land, we would expect people to feel it even several hundred miles out. Same goes for this one. It was offshore, but I did notice that there were a lot of reports of people feeling it light shaking only in coastal regions centered around Newport down south from there, but even inland a bit. So that's interesting. But I don't think it's not atypical for an event like this.
Obviously, we all are worried about the quote unquote big one with the Cascadia subduction quake. Can you quickly walk me through the difference between what we saw yesterday and what we do expect once we do have a Cascadia event?
Yeah, Cascadia earthquake would really be on a whole nother level completely. First of all, the Cascadia subduction zone, the fault line lies right off our shore. So it's where North America is kind of plowing over the seabed, what we call the Juan de Fuca plate out there. And the shaking would be intense and strong and go on for minutes all the way up and down the coast from Northern California to Vancouver Island, in fact. And depending on where the epicenter was, duration shorter or longer, and really strong, and be felt a long way inland as well. This one, completely different fault zone on the other side of the Juan de Fuca plate, a couple of hundred miles further offshore, and so consequent and smaller earthquakes. So a completely different kind of event. Fortunately, Cascadia is rare, and this type of earthquake is much more common.
Let me follow up on that. What makes it common on the Blanco fracture zone? Why is that area so active?
That's a great question. And these transform faults, as we call them, these side by side moving faults, like the Blanco Fracture Zone, just seem to have their characteristic is smaller earthquakes, but more frequent. So the plates have to move and they get stuck and they slide a little, and it happens every year or so, or really frequently like that. Whereas what's happening with Cascadia is the plate has to push over the other plate, and somehow that makes it lock up more strongly, sits there for literally several hundred years and then goes all at once. And that's why the earthquake is so much bigger when it happens. It's sort of the accumulated strain of a few centuries instead of just, a few years or a decade or something like that.
With current technology and seafloor mapping, is there any way to identify any areas on the Cascadia subduction zone that would be more likely to slip? Or is it just one of those things where we just kind of have to wait until the event happens?
Well, it's there's sort of the answer is a partial yes to that. We do have an ability to map out the way the strain is building up. And again, it's over centuries, so it still doesn't tell us, whether it's going to be tomorrow or months from now or many decades or even centuries from now. But we can see that there's more strain actually, it turns out, off the coast of Washington state, and a little bit less, but still significant amount off of the coast of Oregon, for example. So we can map out different areas of that strain buildup. But what that doesn't help with is knowing, when the next magnitude 8 or magnitude 9 earthquake will actually occur. So we really have to be prepared for that all the way up and down the whole Pacific Northwest shoreline region.
One quick, I was reading a paper. I just graduated from Mississippi State with a degree in meteorology, but took a bunch of plate tectonics and
Yeah,
oceanography classes,
great.
and wrote kind of just a random paper that was saying You could connect the San Andreas Fault all the way up to Cascadia and a bunch of other stuff. Where is that science right now? Is that actually true? Can you trace a connection point between those two fault lines?
There has been a recent study published. Main author was Chris Goldfinger out of Oregon State University. And what they've done is they've used the deposits of undersea landslides and tried to date them and suggest a correlation across the boundary between the southern Cascadia subduction zone and the northern San Andreas Fault. They do meet at a place called Cape Mendocino in California. Um, in that paper, they make an argument that the data supports the idea that they're somehow linked, that when one goes, the other either goes at the same time or very close kind of time proximity. I would say the jury is still out on that question. A lot of other people think that the evidence is circumstantial that supports that, let's just say. And I don't think we know the answer at this point. That's definitely a topic for further research. Um, in a way, we know that both of them are big seismically active faults. So whether they're tied to each other or not, the hazard is there on both sides of that boundary. It's just a matter of whether they're likely to go, as a 1-2 punch or even all at once or really unlinked in time. And we don't know.
That begs the question, what happens if they were to go either both at the same time or as that 1-2 punch?
Yeah.
What would the Western United States look like?
Yeah, we'd have very large earthquake damage in both places. So it would extend the earthquake damage region to a much larger area. Even if each area was preparing for damage and hazards, you can imagine that that might, stress the ability of federal response, of state responses across the different states. We often, for any kind of disaster, like when a fire happens or a flood, we rely on neighboring regions to send in resources, right? To send in reinforcements, essentially. If everything's happening where there's an earthquake that covers really such a much larger region, that just makes it that much harder to do that. So I think it would stress the response more than we would otherwise see. That's probably the main impact in a sense, because again, both areas can expect a large earthquake in the future. It's just that having them come all at once really makes it even harder to pick up the pieces and restore services, stuff like that.
Let me go real quick back to Blanco.
Yeah.
We know the areas, as you said, is super active, and we see earthquake swarms all the time with that. Is there any other place up and down the Oregon and Washington coast that's that active, or is Blanco just kind of just the epicenter where all those kind of come together?
Yeah, in terms of frequency of earthquakes, Blanco is definitely the winner. It's the most active. The other part, though, of course, is actually the Mendocino Fracture Zone, which is at Cape Mendocino in California. But if you're talking about Oregon and Washington, no, Blanco is where we see the most earthquakes happening. The scary thing about this Cascadia Subduction Zone, in a way, is that it's actually really silent. It really does not produce offshore earthquakes. And in fact, in the last, as long as we have records, like 150 years or more, it's never produced an earthquake that was on the fault between the two plates of larger than about magnitude 5. That's really nothing. What it means is that all of that strain is actually just accumulating, not having other earthquakes in between. At the off Vancouver Island, there's another fault zone called the Nootka Fault, which also produces a lot of earthquakes, maybe smaller magnitude, but more frequent. So that's the trade-off, smaller magnitude, more frequent versus storing up the strain and really then only going in the largest ones. That's what we see for Cascadia.
Is there any way to know how much land displacement or water displacement would happen? Do we know how far it would slip? Or again, is it just one of those things where we just kind of have to wait to see?
We have a lot of information about, and this is geological information about what happened in 1700, the last time the Cascadia Subduction Zone had a giant earthquake. And so we can use that as a model, basically say the next one is at least somewhat likely to look like the most recent previous one. Then what people are doing is building big computer simulations, right? Computer models to try to test that out. And then they try ranging on that, based on all the geologic information we have from a little bit smaller to a little bit bigger event and so on and so forth. So yeah, we do have a good idea. And what we know is that the seafloor can be moved by as much as, several meters, 10, 20, 30 feet. It doesn't sound like a lot, but what that does is over a large area, that displaces the ocean. That literally pops the seafloor up, which pops the water up. And then water, of course, doesn't, make a bulge, make a hill. And what it does is it starts a ripple, a wave moving away from that area to flatten back out again. It's that wave that is the tsunami that would come into the coast. So there are different scenarios. We could have a southern end of Cascadia only earthquake. Maybe that would only be a magnitude 8 to 8.3 or 4. That would still create a large tsunami that would affect more southern half of Oregon into Northern California. We could have a magnitude 9 that really covers the entire region from Canada all the way to Northern California. We could have a northern only event. All these different things are possibilities. So we have models. And we're actually actively doing lots more simulation of what those effects are. And then for each community along the coast, there are what are those inundation maps. Those maps that say where to go to get out of the danger zone are based on that kind of simulation of what the effects might be for these different scenarios. In the end, it's an estimate. These are probabilities, not certainties, and so we have to make our best educated guesses.
I want to ask you about that real quick with those maps. Obviously, you can download some really fascinating apps on your phone, Shake Alert being one of them. Talk about that technology and how that's really kind of increased awareness, especially along the West Coast in the last few years.
Yeah, we do have a couple of big things that have, I think, increased public safety. So one is Shake Alert and the ability to detect the earthquake early as it's just beginning, make an estimate of how big it is and where it's located, and then warn people further away. Now, we can only do that once we've detected the beginnings of the shaking wave. So that depends on our seismometers being close to the source of the earthquake. That's why we've got hundreds and hundreds of instruments now all across Washington and Oregon. And then that sends out an alert that can give you anywhere from a few seconds to actually as much as a minute or more of potential advance warning for especially an offshore earthquake where it has to come in from offshore. That's an important factor. The other one is really our always increasing understanding of exactly what the tsunami inundations might look like. Inundation meaning where the water goes. And so we're refining those estimates and the tsunami warnings that would go with the earthquake to tell people, okay, time to evacuate to higher ground. First drop cover and hold on, take cover from the earthquake, but as soon as the shaking subsides, if you're in the coastal region, if you're in a tsunami hazard zone, move to high ground. Doesn't have to be far, just the nearest place that's, more than, let's say, 50 feet above the water, above sea level or something like that, and get out of the danger zone.
Where can people learn more information about what you guys are doing up there at the University of Washington and the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network?
Yeah, great resources. Our own website, it's just pnsn.org, pnsn.org. We'll give you lots of information. I would also recommend people to look at the websites of the Oregon Emergency Management Division of the state or the Washington EMD, also Emergency Management Department. They both have great websites with lots of information about these hazards.